Globalization and International Law. Hey guys! Today we will be learning about how globalization has positive and negative impacts on international law. Throughout this video, me, Grace, Shreya, and Ryan will be going in depth on what international law is, what globalization is, and how they are connected. So what exactly is international law? International law is defined by the legal career path as the set of rules, agreements, and treaties that are binding between countries. Essentially, it's the outline that determines how the international community interacts with one another.
It promotes peace, justice, trade, and common interests. International law has two branches, jus gentium and jus inter gentes. Jus gentium is not a law or legal code that is set in stone or concrete. It is rather an accepted body of laws which governs the relations between countries. Meanwhile, jus inter gentes is the body of treaties or agreements which two countries mutually accept. There are three types of international law: public international law, private international law, and supranational law. Public international law are laws which affect nations and the people. On the other hand, private international law governs private conflicts between individuals rather than between the states. Finally, supranational law refers to when nations surrender to the court their right to make certain judicial decisions.
So what is globalization? Globalization, on the other hand, is the increasing interdependence of economies, political systems, and societies on a global scale. It is a process which expands the interconnectedness in our world. Recently, this has been on the rise due to the easy availability of technology that we can use to communicate with anyone, anywhere.
What exactly does globalization have to do with international law? Globalization over history has impacted everything from trade to everyday life, and it hasn't left international law alone. Throughout history, globalization and international law have always been interconnected, as globalization introduced different ideas, such as the European public law. According to Globalization by Frederick Maigret, which states globalization then became the vehicle by which European public law was projected onto the world. With the spread of the state model, naturally came to the imposition or reception of the system of public international law as a means to normatively articulate the relations between states. Although globalization has benefited the spread of ideas of international laws across the globe, globalization has also been the reason for the law to collapse in many time periods and reinvent itself after periods of crisis.
What pressures does globalization put on international law? There's no doubt that globalization has had an impact on international law, but determining whether the influence has been beneficial or detrimental is a question that remains to be answered. It is known that many globalists believe that globalization threatens international law. However, this is quite a complicated topic as there is no definitive evidence except that of opinion. We believe that such a nuanced topic has many different positives and negatives to consider before reaching a conclusion. One of the biggest sources of pressure that comes from globalization are the countries' fear of losing their sovereignty.
But does globalization lead to the loss of autonomy or sovereignty? Simple. It is debatable, but it can be said that globalization leads to the loss of autonomy and sovereignty. Autonomy, since the growing interconnectedness of individuals and groups around the world, will make it difficult for each individual or group to make their own decisions without affecting others. Sovereignty, since once again, the interconnectedness of the world will make it harder for a sovereign to successfully have supreme control and power over itself as the interconnectedness grows. Specifically, according to one of the three globalization theories, the hyperglobalist theory, globalization leads to a lack of sovereignty. Professor Dr. Nicolas Esperanza of International Black Sea University writes that because of globalization, governments can lose control over various levels of their national economies and cede absolute sovereignty in foreign affairs and defense.
The increasing amount of external influence on a state due to globalization means that states have less say in the matters of how their nation interacts with the rest of the world. This includes areas such as military action. States might even feel more pressured to share their plans with other countries. Not only do they cede some autonomy here, but when entering relationships with other nations, they also give up some of their sovereignty. The article, International Law Reconsidered, Is International Law Actually Law?, states limits on sovereignty must be consented to by any states when signing treaties or joining international legal conventions. So every time an international law or agreement is created between countries, each country is giving up some of their control. Some agreements are happening more and more because of globalization better connecting markets and states.
On the other hand, globalization also provides a stable basis for cooperation between states and can help prevent conflict between opposing states. Konstantin J. Patalids, a doctor of law who graduated from Fordham University, also wrote, "States reap immeasurable economic and security benefits from the relatively peaceful borders, global trade, and open air and sea navigation that the international legal regime provides, and they will continue to follow its tenets so long as they cannot find a greater opportunity outside the system." International law was born from the practice of states pursuing their interests to achieve mutually beneficial outcomes. An example of this kind of beneficial multinational organization is the World Trade Organization, an institution that is best understood as resolving bilateral disputes between states.
With better coordination between countries, the next big question is if globalization is ultimately leading towards a unified world legal system, would it be a good thing? A more unified legal system has its benefits. Professor Jose Alvarez, professor of law at Columbia University, stated that international organizations provide an alternate way to initiate treaties instead of systems coordinated by countries. More avenues for creating treaties means more treaties for the betterment of the world.
However, because of globalization, international organizations are able to assert themselves in the process of creating laws. Professor Angela Banks from Arizona State University writes, "Despite the continued importance of states, a recurring point at the 2003 Hague Joint Conference on Contemporary Issues of International Law was that states are no longer the sole actors within international legal systems. Because multinational corporations have more influence in economies all around the world, and other non-state organizations are able to reach a wider platform, they are able to influence proceedings by creating resistance or support."
Although the fact that the state no longer has full control may sound concerning, there are actually many benefits considering that the international organizations are able to hold countries accountable. Also, according to Professor Banks, as a result of this widening sphere of influence, it is critical that stakeholders have access to the relevant non-state actors and the means to hold them accountable. Another benefit is that it lets more nations communicate with each other and lets nations collaborate and create solutions and laws to address similar issues.
Even though there are more international connections and comprehensive international laws leading towards a world legal system, these laws aren't always followed. Patalids wrote that documents like the Declaration of Human Rights and organizations such as the International Criminal Court are highly aspirational and idealistic, but are subject to state consent and are flouted quite frequently. Just because globalization provides states with more opportunities to create international laws doesn't mean that the new laws will be followed.
However, international organization might be able to serve an important purpose. As Kuwait's Prime Minister said recently in his speech at the UN, there is no doubt that the growing threat of terrorism and violent extremism is one of the most dangerous challenges facing the world order. This raises the question, should the world come together to create a unified means of responding to terrorism?
It is debatable, however, there is support that yes, the world should come together to create a unified means of responding to terrorism. The UN is already using a more multinational way of combating terrorism. Because there's a system and a set of guidelines set by the UN, all countries represented in the General Assembly can come together to fight terrorism. The goal of the UN Office of Counterterrorism is to take urgent action to prevent and combat terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, and in particular, to consider becoming parties without delay to the existing international conventions and protocols against terrorism, and implementing them, and to make every effort to reach an agreement on and conclude a comprehensive convention on international terrorism.
To recap, overall, the influence and pressures that globalization has on international law is debatable in terms of its beneficial or detrimental relation, as it can be considered from many different viewpoints. However, it does put pressures in terms of growing unity and interconnectedness of our world. In terms of loss of sovereignty and autonomy, globalization does, to an extent, lead to their losses as interconnectedness and power and peace to all grows. Due to globalization and international laws, growth and interconnectedness and global peace and prosperity, it would ultimately lead to a unified world legal system.
And in order to maintain the ideals of international laws and globalization, the world should come together to create a unified means of responding to a national or global threat of terrorism. Globalization in terms of international law can be seen as a good thing for international conflicts and disputes, the loss of autonomy and sovereignty, or a new way of combating terrorism on the global scale. No matter how you look at it, globalization is a force that has an ever-increasing amount of weight in matters of international law. When studying its influence, it is important to consider all the complex implications that it can have on the world.